The thermometer outside the armory had stopped working at 11 that morning, not because it broke, because it ran out of numbers. Sergeant Dale Hutchins had watched it happen, the red line climbing past 108, past 110, pressing against the top of the glass like something trying to escape. He tapped the casing twice with his knuckle, the way a man taps a gas gauge he doesn't trust. The mercury didn't move. He walked away. That was the kind of summer Fort Harmon gave you. The base sat low in the Sonoran Desert, 40 miles east of Tucson, surrounded by nothing but creosote scrub and the kind of silence that made new recruits nervous. Not a real silence, the desert was never actually quiet. It was full of sound. The hiss of wind pushing sand across tarmac, the metallic groan of prefab roofing expanding in the heat, the distant percussion of the shooting range. But there was no human sound, no laughter, no idle conversation. When it was this hot, men conserved everything. The base was small by military standards. 2 main barracks, an operations building with blacked-out windows, a motor pool that smelled of diesel and rubber, and at the far north end, half hidden behind a concrete blast wall, the armory, a low, wide structure with a corrugated roof that sang in the wind and a steel door heavy enough to stop a truck. It was inside that door that things had gone wrong. General Marcus Webb had arrived at Fort Harmon 3 days earlier, unannounced. No convoy, no ceremony, just a black SUV trailing a rooster tail of dust up the main road, and then Webb himself stepping out, 61 years old, silver-haired, built like something carved rather than grown. He carried no visible rank on the clothes he wore that first day, but every soldier on the base felt it anyway. The way the air changed when he walked through a room, the way conversation died and posture corrected itself without anyone issuing an order. Webb had a reputation that preceded him the way weather precedes a storm. 2 combat deployments, 1 classified operation that existed in official records only as a redacted paragraph, and a particular attachment to the Barrett M107, the 50 caliber anti-material rifle that had served as his primary instrument in operations he would never name, in places that did not officially exist. His Barrett was not a standard-issue weapon. It had been modified and remodified over 15 years until it was something closer to a personal artifact than a firearm. Custom stock, hand-lapped bolt, a muzzle brake that a machinist in Virginia had made to Webb's exact specifications and then refused to duplicate for anyone else. The optic had been reseroed so many times the turret markings had been worn smooth by Webb's thumb. He trusted that rifle the way other men trusted God. The rifle knew it, too, if objects can know things. 15 years of careful maintenance had worn the finish off the pistol grip in exactly the shape of Webb's hand. The stock had been adjusted and readjusted until it fit the particular geometry of his shoulder, his neck, his cheekbone. The scope had been zeroed so many times and in so many conditions, mountain cold, jungle humidity, the specific oven-dry heat of this desert, that the internal adjustments had developed a kind of memory. You zeroed it for sea level and it wanted to go right. You compensated with 1 click left and it settled like something recognizing a familiar position. The armorers who had handled it over the years all said the same thing. There was nothing remarkable about the mechanical configuration of Webb's Barrett. Every part was within specification. The modifications were sensible, professional. There was no obvious reason it should perform better than any other rifle of its type, but it did. And now it would not fire. The bolt had seized, not jammed, seized. There was a distinction, and every armorer on the base knew it. A jam could be cleared. A seized bolt was something else. The mechanism locked against itself with a force that suggested heat expansion, sand infiltration, or a failure in the chamber that none of them could identify by looking. Sergeant First Class Roy Mercer, the best armorer at Fort Harmon, possibly the best armorer in the Southwest, had spent 40 minutes on it. He'd tried the standard clearing procedures. He'd field-stripped the upper receiver with the careful hands of a surgeon. He'd found nothing obvious. The bolt would not cycle. Mercer set the rifle down on the workbench and stepped back. "I don't see it, sir." Webb looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "Then look harder," Webb said. Mercer looked harder. It didn't help. The woman who cleaned the armory was named Ellie Carr. She was 34 years old, brown-haired, medium height, with the kind of unremarkable face that people stopped noticing as soon as they looked away. She had worked at Fort Harmon for 8 months. Part of the civilian contractor crew that handled facility maintenance on the non-classified sections of the base. She came in at 6 in the morning, cleaned what needed cleaning, and left before noon. She spoke rarely. She never asked questions. She ate lunch alone in her car, a 10-year-old Civic parked near the south gate. and she read paperback novels with their covers bent back so no one could see what they were. The soldiers who noticed her at all thought of her the way they thought of the vending machines or the fire extinguisher brackets present: functional, uninteresting. She had a system, and the system was invisible. She arrived before anyone was paying attention and left before anyone thought to ask where she'd gone. She knew which hallways were busy at which hours. She knew which officers ran early and which ran late. She knew the rotation of the range schedule by heart, not because she had asked for it, but because she had listened, over 8 months, to the ambient conversation of a military base, which was relentlessly predictable in its routines, the way all institutions are. She had learned, a long time ago, that institutions were safe. Not comfortable safe. An institution had rules and schedules and hierarchies that made individual attention scarce. Nobody looked hard at the person in the gray coveralls as long as the floors were clean and the supply forms were filed. She had filed every form. She had cleaned every floor. Nobody had noticed that she always finished her work in the motor pool before the range opened, and then found small, unhurried tasks to occupy herself near the observation platform. Nobody had noticed that when the breezes shifted in the early afternoon, that particular thermal change that came off the rock formations to the east, she would pause whatever she was doing and stand still for exactly 2 or 3 seconds, her face turned slightly into the wind. Nobody had noticed that she never used hearing protection on the rare occasions she was in the vicinity of the range, and that her eyes tracked the impact points on distant targets, with a precision that no casual observer should have managed at that distance. Nobody had noticed the way she watched the borehole rifle range. Not casually. Not with the idle curiosity of a civilian. The way you watch a thing you already understand. She was pushing her cleaning cart through the corridor outside the armory when she heard Mercer's voice through the steel door. Not the words, the door was too heavy for words, but the tone, the particular, carefully controlled frustration of a skilled man who has run out of answers and is beginning the process of accepting it without accepting at the stage just before surrender, when every word is chosen to not sound like what it is. She knew that tone. She had heard it in her own voice once, standing in a different room in front of a different kind of problem, 17 seconds ticking away. She stopped, stood there a moment with both hands on the cart handle, looking at the steel door. The armory was not her responsibility. The armory was cleaned by a separate contractor team with higher clearance. She had no business reason to be near it. She knew this. She also knew the sound of a seized bolt. You could hear it in a room even through a heavy door if you knew what to listen for. The particular dead silence that followed an unsuccessful cycle, compared to the clean mechanical snap of a working one. She had heard it the moment she'd stopped in the corridor. The absence of the right sound. She set the cart against the wall, stood there a moment longer. Then she pushed the armory door open. The briefing had gone worse than Webb expected, and his expectations had been low. 22 minutes. That was the window. In 22 minutes, a man named Dreykov, a logistics coordinator for a network that moved things across borders in ways that governments were very interested in stopping, would cross an open stretch of desert between 2 structures at a waypoint that had taken 11 months of intelligence work to identify. The distance from the designated firing position to that crossing point was listed in the mission file as 2,340 meters. 2,340 meters. The Barrett M107, in the right hands, was capable of accurate fire at that distance. In the wrong hands, it was a theoretical exercise. In Webb's hands, it was a certainty, or had been, before the bolt seized. There were other rifles in the armory. None of them were built for this distance. The best alternative Mercer could offer was a system that topped out reliably at 1,500 meters, and even that assumed ideal conditions. The desert gave you sand and thermals and wind that shifted direction every 40 seconds. Conditions were never ideal. 20 minutes, said Lieutenant Aaron Greer, who was standing near the door and looking at his watch, the way a man watches a tourniquet bleed through. I heard you the first time, Webb said. He looked at the Barrett on the workbench. 15 years. Every mission that mattered. He had cleaned it himself, always. He knew every millimeter of it. Something was wrong with the bolt that none of these men could see. He knew that too. Ellie Carr pushed the armory door open. Nobody stopped her immediately because nobody expected it. The door was heavy and civilian contractors had keycard access to the outer corridor. By the time anyone processed what was happening, a woman in gray maintenance coveralls walking into an active briefing, she was already 3 steps inside. Out, said Greer. Civilian, you need to. The bolt. She was looking at the Barrett on the workbench. Not at Greer, not at Webb, at the rifle. What happened to it? You need to leave this area right now. She can answer the question, Webb said. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at her. Something had happened in the half-second between Greer's command and Webb's countermand. Later, none of the men in that room could explain it precisely. Webb had looked at her face, at her eyes, specifically, the way they had moved across the Barrett, and something had shifted in his own expression. Not much, barely enough to notice, but Webb was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he had said, "She can answer the question." Ellie Carr walked to the workbench. She didn't ask for permission to pick the rifle up. She didn't look around for approval. She set both hands on the weapon, her right on the pistol grip, her left steadying the barrel, and turned it slightly in the light from the overhead fluorescence. She looked at the bolt carrier. She tipped the rifle forward 15 degrees, then back. Then she set it down, reached into the front pocket of her coveralls, and produced a small flat blade tool, the kind used to adjust ventilation slats, not firearms. She used the flat edge, not as a tool, but as a surface, pressed lightly against the underside of the bolt handle and rotated it with a force so specific and controlled it looked almost like nothing, like she was brushing dust from a shelf. A sound, small, metallic, the sound of something releasing. She cycled the bolt once, smooth, complete, instantaneous. Set the rifle down, stepped back. Casing fragment, she said. Microscopic piece of brass inside the locking lug channel. Heat expansion locked it against the recess wall. When metal cools it releases, but the friction had left a deposit. Needs to be swabbed before the next round. She looked at Mercer. "You have a 50 calories bore snake?" Mercer stared at her. "He's asking if you have a bore snake," Webb said quietly. "Yes, sir." Mercer turned to the cabinet. Ellie Carr took the boar snake when he handed it back, ran it through the chamber once with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this specific action 10,000 times, checked the channel visually, and set the snake on the bench. "Ready," she said. The room was silent. Not the desert silence, the human kind. Webb loaded around himself. He lifted the rifle, settled it against his shoulder in the shooter's stance, the particular geometry of a man who has owned this motion for so long it lives in his muscles rather than his memory. He aimed at the far wall of the armory, where a target had been pinned for dry fire practice. He cycled the bolt. It moved like water. He set the rifle down and looked at Ellie Carr. "Where did you learn that?" he said. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "I've seen it before." "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed, and turned toward the door. "Wait." She stopped. "Your name?" "Carr. I'm with Meridian Facility Services. My contractor ID is—" "I know who you are on paper," Webb said. "That's not what I asked." She said nothing. Webb looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man filing something away, and looked at Greer. "Test fire. North Range." Now, the North Range at Fort Harmon extended 800 meters and was used primarily for zeroing and qualification. There was a secondary position unmaintained, not on any official training schedule, another 1,400 meters beyond that, where the range opened into a long natural valley between 2 ridgelines. Webb had identified it on his second day. He'd walked it alone at dawn, reading the terrain the way he always did. Not for cover or concealment, but for the way wind moved through it. The desert wind was never simple. It followed channels between rock faces, rose and fell with temperature gradients, doubled back on itself near elevation changes. Every shooter who worked at distance understood this. Most of them managed it with instruments, kestrel meters, applied ballistics software, spotter calculations. Webb had always managed it differently. Greer ran the test fire. The first round downrange, at 800 meters, struck within 2 centimeters of center. Webb handed the rifle to Corporal James Forsyth, the base's best-rated shooter after Webb himself, and watched him fire at the same target, 3 centimeters from center. He handed the rifle back to Greer. "It's right." He looked at his watch. 14 minutes. "Problem," Greer said. Webb looked at him. "Forsyth." Greer's voice dropped. "He took a fragment last night. Training accident. Left shoulder. Doc cleared him for light duty, but not for this." "Not for this," Greer confirmed. 14 minutes. 2,340 meters. A crossing window of approximately 30 seconds when Dreykov would be in the open. Webb was 61 years old. His right eye had lost approximately 15% of its acuity to a pressure issue 3 years ago. He had not disclosed this in any medical exam and did not intend to. At 800 meters, it made no practical difference. At 2,300 meters, it was the difference between a certainty and a probability, and in his experience, probabilities had a habit of going wrong. He ran through the options once more. There was no third shooter on base with qualification above 1,200 meters. He could call Greer. Greer was capable and steady, but he was a coordinator and a planner, not a long-range shooter, and he knew it. He could abort the mission and request a replacement from the next nearest facility, which would take a minimum of 6 hours, and by then, Dreykov would be in a vehicle crossing into Mexico. He could attempt the shot himself and accept the probability. Probability. The word sat in his mind like a splinter. He had spent 40 years eliminating probabilities. That was what all the training was, all the maintenance, all the careful pre-dawn walks through terrain that other people hadn't bothered to read. Probability was what you had when you hadn't prepared enough. He had always prepared enough, until today, when his own eye, which he had never told anyone about, was the variable he couldn't eliminate. He was standing there, doing the arithmetic of it, when he became aware that Ellie Carr had not left. She was standing near the wall of the range house, her cleaning cart behind her, watching him work through the problem, not watching the rifle, watching him, watching the way his jaw moved slightly when he was running numbers, watching his eyes track from his watch to the valley and back. She had watched people work through problems before. He could see that. She was reading him the way she read the wind. "You can see what I'm calculating," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer. "Can you shoot?" he said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Webb watched something happen behind her eyes. Not decision, the decision had been made before she answered. What he watched was the moment before a decision becomes visible, the moment when a person who has been one thing for a long time accepts that they are about to become another thing again. "If the wind doesn't change," she said. Her real name was not on the Fort Harmon contractor manifest. The name Ellie Carr was real. It was her mother's maiden name combined with a childhood nickname, documents she had obtained legally 6 years ago when she stopped being who she had been. The paperwork was clean. There had been no official reason to look past it. Her actual name, the one that appeared in a classified file in a building in Virginia that most people didn't know existed, was Corporal First Class Elena Carver, USMC Scout Sniper Program, discharged under administrative circumstances that were themselves classified. Call sign, Ghost Viper. She had compiled a service record that sat in that file like a controlled substance, handled carefully, kept locked, mentioned in internal memos only by personnel number. Longest confirmed shot in a program that didn't officially keep records. 2,910 meters. Mountainous terrain, crosswind, thermal shimmer, single round. The program's assessment of her was the kind of document that made evaluators uncomfortable in proportion to how honest they were. She scored in the upper fractions of a percent in spatial calculation, wind reading, and what the psychologist who administered the battery called environmental integration, the ability to process multiple environmental variables simultaneously and derive a single, unified ballistic solution without performing the conscious steps sequentially. Most elite shooters ran the calculation in sequence. Wind, then elevation, then mirage red, then trigger timing. She appeared to run it in parallel, or not at all, as if the variables bypassed calculation entirely and arrived directly as a physical knowledge. The way a musician's fingers find a chord without the musician thinking about finger positions. The psychologist had written, "This evaluee's performance at extended range appears to involve a sensory processing mode that falls outside the normal parameters of trained marksmanship. Recommend further study." Nobody had funded the further study. She had been too useful in the field to spare for research. She had left the military at 27. The reason, the actual reason, not the administrative one, was something she had not spoken aloud since the debrief that had closed her file. She had spent the years since then getting smaller, quieter, finding work that required physical presence and zero visibility. Facility maintenance, light logistics, anything that put her in a building with a routine and a clipboard and nobody looking at her too closely. She had not touched a long-range rifle in 6 years. They walked the range together while Greer briefed her. She listened without asking questions, which told Webb more than the questions would have. She already understood the mission parameters. She was listening for the things Greer hadn't said. What the terrain looked like between the firing position and the target, what the thermals would do at this hour, whether the intel on the crossing route was primary or derived. "Primary source?" she said, when Greer paused. "2 independent confirmations," Greer said. 12-hour window closed 2 hours ago." She nodded. At the firing position, a flat rock shelf at the western ridgeline, naturally sheltered from the south wind by a formation that looked accidental but functioned like a perfect hide, she set the rifle down on its bipod and lay behind it. She did not touch the optic. She looked at the target zone with naked eyes first. Webb watched her do this and said nothing. 2,340 meters. At this time of day, the thermal column rising off the valley floor would create a mirage effect that would make the target appear to drift horizontally at the optic. Inexperienced shooters compensated for the mirage. Experienced shooters read it, used it as a wind indicator, measuring the angle of drift to calculate the actual lateral push at different points along the bullet's flight path. She was reading it. He could tell by the way her eyes moved, not scanning, but tracing, following something. 3.2 meters left offset, she said quietly. Variable. Wind is cycling every. She paused 45 seconds, gusting to steady pattern. She was not using instruments. She pressed her cheek to the stock. 6 minutes. Greer stood back. Forsyth, his left arm in a soft sling, had positioned himself as spotter not because he could fully perform the role, but because he couldn't not be there. He knelt behind her and to the right, scope up, watching the target zone. 2 of the other soldiers had moved back instinctively. Not ordered to, they just had. The desert was loud and quiet at the same time. Wind in the scrub, the metal groan of the range house roof. Somewhere far off, a bird, some kind of hawk, calling once and then going silent. The sun was at an angle that turned the valley floor amber, the shadows from the rock formations long and precise. She controlled her breathing. Webb watched the slight rise and fall of her back slow and then slow further and then find the rhythm. 4 counts in, 4 out, the shooter's breath, the one you don't think about, the one that lives below thought. 40 seconds, Greer said. She said nothing. Her left hand was on the forend of the stock, lightly. The way you hold something you don't want to disturb. Her right index finger was outside the trigger guard. Thermal column shifted, Forsyth said. Low voice. Offset is. I see it, she said. 20 seconds. The wind rose slightly. Dropped. Rose again. She felt it on her face, the sun-warmed air coming up the valley, not straight but oblique, clocking maybe 8 degrees east of the direct line. She adjusted in the scope, not a physical adjustment to the rifle. An internal one, a recalculation happening somewhere behind her eyes that didn't involve numbers, only geometry, only the felt sense of a projectile moving through air she had already learned. 10. Her finger moved inside the guard. Target, Forsyth said. Moving. Confirmed. She exhaled halfway. Held. The world at the shooting position became the simplest possible version of itself. No base, no history, no name, old or new. No file in a locked cabinet in Virginia, no years of careful smallness, only the thermal column, only the wind cycling in its 45-second pattern, just past its peak now, beginning to fall toward steady. Only the distance, which was not distance anymore but time, the time around at this velocity would take to cross that valley, during which the target would have moved forward by a calculated amount that she had already accounted for by aiming at a point in empty air where a man would be in 2.3 seconds. She squeezed. The sound was enormous, and then gone. The concussive wave hit the rock face behind them and came back, changed, dispersed. Dust rose from the bipod contact point. The muzzle brake did its work. She cycled the bolt, did not move her eye from the optic, waited. Forsyth's breathing changed first. Webb heard it, the slight involuntary catch. Hit, Forsyth said. His voice was strange. Careful, the way you are careful with something fragile. Confirmed hit, he said again. Target is. I know, she said. She lifted her cheek from the stock, stood up. The desert went about its business. Wind, heat, the hawk somewhere distant calling once more. The valley was the same valley it had been 6 minutes ago. The rock shelf was the same rock shelf. The sun hadn't moved perceptibly. Nobody spoke for a long time. Webb looked at her. She was brushing dust from her left sleeve with the automatic gesture of someone who does it constantly, who lives in places where dust accumulates. Her face showed nothing identifiable. Not satisfaction, not relief, not the particular flatness that comes after violence. Something else. Something that might have been the expression of a person who has just done something they had promised themselves they would never do again, and found that it came back as easily as breathing. Greer, Webb said. Sir. Secure the position. Brief me at the ops building in 20. Yes, sir. He looked at her. Walk with me. They walked back along the ridgeline, away from the others. The sun was lower now, the heat marginally less insane. A dust devil twisted up from the valley floor below them, spun 20 meters, and dissolved. Another formed 30 yards east of it, and lasted longer, a column of turning sand that moved slowly northward, tracking the thermal gradient along the valley floor with an almost purposeful direction. She watched it until it dissolved. "You're still reading it," Webb said. She looked away. "You didn't stop," he said. "In 6 years. You still read every piece of wind you walk through." She didn't deny it. There was nothing to deny. A person who can read wind doesn't stop being able to read wind because they've decided not to shoot. The perception and the application were separate things. She had closed the application. The perception had no off switch. "You know what that means," he said. "It means I have a bad habit," she said. "It means you've been practicing for 6 years without a rifle." He looked at her. "Which means today wasn't really your first time back. Today was just the first time you let yourself admit what you'd been doing." She said nothing, but she didn't argue with it. The dust devil had dissolved. Another was forming. "The Bekaa Valley operation," Webb said. "The shot attributed to an unnamed contractor asset in the field report." She said nothing. "That was you." "Nothing." 2,900 meters. "I looked at that file once." He walked a few more paces. The analyst who wrote the assessment said the shot was statistically impossible given the reported conditions. He recommended a review of the sensor data. "He was wrong about the conditions," she said. "I know." Webb stopped walking. She stopped a step after. He'd never been in that valley. He was reading instruments. Instruments can't measure a specific kind of turbulence that occurs when the eastern drainage channel intersects the main thermal at that time of day in late October, she said. The instrument saw a crosswind. It was actually a curl. A curl behaves differently at distance. He looked at her. "You calculated a curl," he said. "At 2,900 meters." She looked out at the valley below. Someone had to. They stood on the ridge for a while without speaking. The desert evening was beginning that brief, extraordinary half hour when the temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes and the light went copper orange and the creosote smelled like rain, even though it hadn't rained in 11 weeks. "Why the maintenance work?" Webb said finally. She thought about the answer before she gave it. Not because it was complicated, because it was the first time in 6 years she had said it out loud to anyone. "Because nobody looks at you," she said. "When you're carrying a mop, nobody looks at your face. Nobody tries to figure out who you are. You're the background, and you needed to be the background for a while." 6 years is a long while. She didn't answer that. He walked a few more paces toward the edge of the ridge, where the rock fell away in a clean drop of about 12 meters to the sandy floor below. He stood there looking out. "The administrative discharge," he said. "The actual reason." A long silence. "I declined an order," she said. He waited. "The target was wrong," she said. "Intel was wrong. I had 17 seconds to evaluate, and I evaluated it as wrong. Chain of command evaluated it as right. I declined. They made their decision about that." She paused. The target walked away. Nobody died. 3 weeks later, the intel was officially revised, but the order was still the order. Webb nodded slowly. The kind of nod that isn't agreement, it's acknowledgement. The recognition that a thing happened the way it happened, and that some things can't be undone even when they're right. "I'd have made the same call," he said. "You outrank me by about 15 grades, she said. "You'd have had the option of making it stick." He turned and looked at her. A slight compression around his eyes, the closest Webb's face came to something wry. "Fair," he said. Greer was waiting at the ops building. He'd gotten there fast, the efficiency of someone who runs everywhere. He closed the door behind them, pulled up the mission summary on the screen at the end of the table, and spent 40 seconds on the debrief. Clean, professional. The target had been confirmed. The mission was closed. He stated the times, the coordinates, the confirmation method. He could have been reading a grocery list for all the emotion in his voice, which was exactly right. Then he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who is she, sir?" Webb poured 2 glasses of water from the jug on the table and set one in front of Greer without comment. Drank from his own, set it down, looked at the wall above the screen, where someone had taped a laminated range card that nobody had bothered to update in what looked like several months. "She's the contractor who fixed my rifle," he said. "With respect, sir." "That's the answer, Aaron." Greer looked at him for a moment. He had worked with Webb long enough to know where the line was. He also knew that Webb used his first name only when he was being direct about something that was not up for discussion. He looked back at the screen. The shot was, he stopped. Started again. "I've been a spotter for 8 years. I've worked with some of the best shooters in the program. 3 of them are in the upper tier of active operators right now." He paused. "That shot, the conditions we recorded after the wind data, the thermal stack, the mirage coefficient from the valley floor, any one of those 3 men I've spotted for, given those conditions, would have had a maybe. An 80% maybe if they were sharp that day, and they'd have needed 15 minutes to dial in. He shook his head. She had no instruments. She called the offset verbally before she was even fully in position. He shook his head again. There's no training program that produces that. Not officially. No, Webb agreed. So how? Some people are born reading wind, Webb said. Most of them never find out. A few of them find a rifle in their hands and then they know. The rifle is just the tool that makes the gift legible. Take the rifle away, and the gift is still there. It doesn't go anywhere. He looked at the surface of the table for a moment. She's one of those. The rarest kind. Greer absorbed this. And then she went and mopped floors, he said. For 6 years, Webb said, the room was quiet for a long time. Through the window, the desert evening light was going red-orange at the edges, the last direct sun cutting low across the rock formations. That's a waste, Greer said. Yes, Webb said. It is. He said it without judgment, without the implication that she had made the wrong choice. He said it the way you state a fact about whether a thing that happened, without a villain, without a remedy now. It was a waste. It had also been, for 6 years, what she needed. Webb understood both things simultaneously. And he understood that understanding both didn't resolve anything. When Webb came out of the ops building, Ellie Carr's cleaning cart was in the corridor. She wasn't with it. Webb stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the cart. The gray plastic frame, the mop in its bucket, a spray bottle of cleaning solution clipped to the side, a paperback book spine cracked, cover folded back wedged between the bucket and the handle frame. He tilted his head to read the title. He couldn't. The cover was folded back. He walked to the south end of the building. Through the glass panel of the fire door, he could see the parking area. Her Civic was still there. He went back and waited. She came from the direction of the range. She had changed out of the shooter's position clothes and back into her maintenance coveralls. She was carrying something small in her right hand, the bore cleaning tool she'd used on the Barrett. She set it on the cart with the automatic economy of a person returning something to its place. You were going back for the rifle, Webb said. I left the bore snake on the range house bench, she said. I would have had someone retrieve it. I know. She gripped the cart handle. He didn't move out of her way. What happens next? He said. It wasn't quite a question. I finished cleaning the administrative wing, she said. I'm behind schedule. That's not what I'm asking. She looked at him. Behind the eyes, that same thing he'd seen before. Not resistance, not fear, something more specific. The look of a person who has gotten very good at not asking themselves a certain question, being asked it by someone else. There are people who would want to talk to you, he said. There are always people who want to talk to me, she said. That's why I carry a mop. These people have different conversations. I know what kind of people you mean. And? She was quiet for a moment. The building made its sounds around them, the ventilation system, the distant hum of servers in the operations wing, the metallic tick of the afternoon heat working on the roof panels. I declined an order once, she said, because the intel was wrong and I was right. And it cost me everything. It cost you your classification, he said. Not everything. It cost me 6 years. Yes, he said. It did. She looked at him for a long time. If I said I needed to think about it, she said, I'd say that was a reasonable answer. She picked up the cart handle. He moved aside. She pushed the cart down the corridor, the small squeaking wheel on the front left caster. The same sound she'd made for 8 months on this base. The sound that made people not look up when she passed. At the end of the corridor, she stopped. She didn't turn around. The shot today, she said. The curl in the thermal. I haven't, a pause. I haven't calculated a curl in 6 years. I didn't know if I still could. He waited. I could, she said. She pushed through the door. Webb stood in the corridor alone for a while. Then he went to his office, sat down, and pulled up a terminal that was not connected to the regular base network. He navigated to a directory that did not have a label, only a number. He entered a personnel number. The file that came up was short 3 pages, most of it redacted. Name, Carver, Elena M. Rate, Corporal First Class, discharged. Specialty, 0317 Scout Sniper. Status, Administrative Separation, 2019. Notes, redacted Level 4 authorization required. At the bottom, in a field marked Remarks, unclassified, individual demonstrated exceptional technical proficiency throughout service. Departure from program resulted from isolated disciplinary action. No pattern of misconduct. Performance metrics in upper 0.2% across all recorded metrics. Aber 0,2%. He sat with that number for a while. He thought about a shot across 2,910 meters of high mountain air in a valley in Lebanon, and an analyst in Virginia who had never been there writing in a report that it was statistically impossible. He thought about a woman who had spent 6 years making herself invisible, carrying a mop through buildings where nobody looked at her, eating lunch alone in a 10-year-old Civic with a paperback novel she didn't want people to read the title of. He thought about the way she had reached into that pocket and produced a flat blade tool, and fixed in 10 seconds what his best armorer had spent 40 minutes failing to fix. He opened a second terminal, navigated to a different directory, began composing a message addressed to a contact in a building in Virginia that most people didn't know existed. He got 3 sentences in and stopped, looked at the screen. She was gone before morning. Greer found her access card on the mat inside the South Gate checkpoint at 0530 when he arrived for the early brief. Just the card, sitting flat on the textured rubber mat, face up, like she'd set it down with some care. Her Civic was gone from the parking area. Her cleaning cart was in the maintenance bay, mopped bucket emptied and upended to dry, the way it was supposed to be. Everything in its place, nothing left out. On the bench in the armory, next to the cleaning station, the boar snake was coiled neatly. Beside it, this one puzzled Mercer for a long time, was a single .50 caliber casing. Clean, polished to a degree that the standard cleaning procedure did not achieve. Just sitting there, alone on the bench, vertical, standing on its primer end, like a period at the end of a sentence. Webb went out to the north ridgeline at dawn. He stood at the firing position, the flat rock shelf with the natural wind shelter behind it. The valley below was filling with the pale morning light, the rock formations casting long westward shadows. The copper orange of the previous evening was gone. The world was gray-blue and specific and silent in the way the desert is silent at first light, before the heat begins its day. He looked out across the valley, 2,340 meters. At this distance, in this light, the far side of the valley was a smudge of gray-brown against the paler sky. No detail, no landmark, just distance, just the enormous fact of the space between here and there, which most people never have occasion to measure with their body, only with maps or numbers, which are abstractions. Standing here and looking at it was different from knowing the number. The number was a fact. The view was an experience. She had stood here and turned the experience back into a calculation that lived below numbers, and the bullet had crossed it. He thought about the curl in the thermal, the specific, unmeasurable turbulence where the eastern drainage channel intersected the main column at a particular hour of a particular season. The thing instruments couldn't read, the thing she had read with her face and her eyes and some accumulated geometry that lived below conscious thought. He thought about the 17 seconds in Bika, the decision made in 17 seconds that had cost her 6 years of deliberate invisibility. He thought about a woman who had spent those 6 years making herself invisible, carrying a mop through buildings where nobody looked at her, eating lunch alone in a 10-year-old Civic with a paperback novel she didn't want people to read the title of. 8 months on this base. How many bases before that? How many corridors? How many mornings arriving before anyone was paying attention? How many evenings leaving before anyone thought to wonder? And every one of those mornings, walking past windows, or across parking lots, or along the edges of places where wind moved freely, feeling it, reading it, not trying to, just unable not to. He thought about the word she had used, could, not can, not a present tense claim about ongoing ability. Could, past tense reaching into the present, still surprised by itself. I could, not, I can still do this, not, I haven't lost it. Just the pure astonishment of a person discovering that the thing they had walked away from had waited for them. He stood there for a long time. The light strengthened. The shadows shortened. The valley floor began its daily process of heating, the first thermals already beginning to rise off the darker rock surfaces. Invisible but present, already organizing themselves into the patterns she would have read without thinking about it if she were standing here instead of wherever she was. The message he had composed last night, 3 sentences addressed to the building in Virginia, was still on the terminal, unsent. He had left it there on purpose. He wanted to sleep on it. He had slept on it. He was still not sure. It was her choice. It would only mean something if it was her choice. The people in Virginia could do a lot of things, but they couldn't give her back the 17 seconds or the 6 years. And any conversation that didn't acknowledge that was a conversation that would fail. He turned and walked back toward the base, and the desert sun came up behind him and filled the valley with hard, clean light, and the rock shelf was just a rock shelf again, unremarkable, like any of the 1,000 other flat surfaces in the Sonoran landscape. There was no sign she had ever been there, only the light, only the distance, and somewhere south on the highway, east on the hardpan roads, wherever she had decided to be next, a woman who had learned to make herself the background was driving in the direction of whatever she had decided to be after this. With the windows down, probably, feeling the air, reading it, Webb reached the base perimeter, stopped at the gate, looked south down the access road where her Civic had been. The road was empty. He went inside. When he sat down at the terminal, he deleted the 3 sentences, started again, wrote something different, shorter, simpler, without any specificity that would start a process she hadn't consented to start. Just a notation, a flag against a personnel number that had been dormant for 6 years. Asset remains active. Recommend passive status. No action pending individual's contact. He looked at it for a moment. Then he sent it. Then he closed the terminal and went to get coffee and spent the rest of the morning doing the ordinary work of a man who runs operations in the desert, the kind of work that fills days without filling the particular silence that some days leave behind. Mercer found the file late that afternoon, while doing inventory on the armory. It was tucked under the cleaning supply log, a single sheet of paper, handwritten, which was unusual enough that he read it twice before understanding what it was. It was a maintenance log, specific to the Barrett M107, written in a hand that was very small and very precise. It listed, in sequence, every step of the procedure she had performed on the rifle, the diagnosis, the micro-tool application, the clearing process, the bore run, the final check. Next to each step, a brief technical note, not for a layperson, for the next armorer, the person who would maintain this weapon after today. At the bottom, in slightly larger letters than the rest, the locking lug channel collects fine sediment before it collects coarse. Check there first in desert conditions. E.C. Mercer read it 3 times. Then he pinned it to the wall above the Barrett's storage rack, where it would be the first thing the next armorer saw when they opened the cabinet. Greer asked Webb once, later 3 months later, at a different base in a different state, what he thought had happened to her. Webb was reading a report. He didn't look up immediately. She found somewhere else to be the background, he said. You think she went back to maintenance work? He thought about it. I think she's doing exactly what she wants to do, he said, which is whatever nobody expects. Greer nodded. The shot's going to be in the record. Unnamed contractor asset. Same language as the Baykar report. Yes. That doesn't bother you? Webb set the report down, looked at Greer. She didn't do it for the record. No, Greer said. I don't suppose she did. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside the window, whatever the weather was doing, rain, in this state, which was different, was doing it against the glass with a steadiness that was almost restful. Upper 0.2%, Webb said, to no one in particular. Greer didn't ask what he meant. Some records are kept in filing cabinets in buildings with no external markings. Some records are kept in the memory of men who have stood on ridgelines at first light and looked out across a distance that most people will never have occasion to consider. And some things, the best things, the most particular things, the things that exist at the exact intersection of natural gift and acquired precision and 17 seconds of moral clarity, don't get recorded at all. They just happen. A thermal curl above a Lebanese valley in October 2019. A brass fragment in a locking lug channel on a 110-degree morning in Arizona. A boar snake coiled neatly on an armory bench beside a single polished casing, standing upright. A woman in gray coveralls pushing a cleaning cart down a corridor, the front left wheel squeaking softly. And the wind, which she had always been able to read. There are people who leave marks, and people who leave the world exactly as they found it. She had learned, over 6 years, to be the second kind, but the desert keeps its own records. In the morning light on that rock shelf, in the thermal that rises every afternoon from the valley floor, in the particular way the wind cycles through 45-second intervals before settling into its steady push from the east. The geometry of that shot was still there, would always be there, waiting for someone who could read it.